Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal correspondent, was sentenced yesterday. His trial was brought forward by a Russian court. He was given 16 years in a high-security penal colony on espionage charges that the US government has denounced as fabricated, as, of course, as his employer and all journalists. Evan Gershkovich has already been held in prison for 16 months. Now he's, as I say, facing 16 years in a penal colony. Let's speak to Russia expert Mark Galiotti. Mark, very good morning to you. I mean, this is just terrible news. And that trial, if we can call it that, was behind closed doors as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and in a way, I mean, if one's really looking for little shreds of silver lining in that, they very much rushed through the trial. They didn't present any of their evidence. I mean, clearly this is a kangaroo court. But on the other hand, the very fact that they wanted to make this go so quickly does suggest that maybe there is talk of a deal to swap him in the offing, because that was probably the goal. Because the point is, the Russians don't swap prisoners until after they've been convicted. So now at least Gershkovich is eligible for that. But otherwise, as you say, I mean, this was a ridiculous case in which the Russian government, which usually loves presenting any evidence it has of foreign spies, whether it's grainy surveillance video or confessions of alleged compatriots and whatever, in this case hasn't presented anything, just more or less said, we know he's a spy, we're going to convict him in absentia and stick him into rot in a penal colony until you Americans make a deal with us.
OK, before we examine that in a bit more depth about what might happen, let's just rewind a bit, Mark, and talk about what are the trumped-up charges? What was he accused of? What did he do? I mean, he's a working journalist, working, as it turns out, in a hostile environment.
Yes, I mean, Evan Gershkovich, one of the sort of fixtures, shall we say, of the Moscow media scene, worked for the Wall Street Journal, and was definitely one of the more intrepid journalists. And he had gone out to Yekaterinburg, which is off to the east of Moscow, an industrial city. And he was accused of being a CIA agent and trying to gather information about Uralvagonzavod, which is one of the big Russian tank manufacturers. Now, it may well be that he was talking to workers from Uralvagonzavod, because again, that's part of his job, to gauge the mood of the sort of the industrial heartland of Russia. But what the Russian government has turned this into is precisely, reasons for them to claim that he was actually trying to sort of gather some kind of military secrets.
And it all coincides with the invasion, the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Yes, and I think in that context, this is why we really need to understand that really the Russian state has turned to hostage-taking as part of its tradecraft or its statecraft. It has more or less internalized the idea that it is at political, at the very least, as well as economic war with the West. And therefore, not only is it almost insanely paranoid at times about Westerners, and I say this as someone who's been banned from Russia since 2022, but also that more or less doesn't really care what we think. It's internalized its pariah status, and therefore it is willing to act in often the most blatant ways.
Well, how much leverage does the United States in particular have in these circumstances? As you say, the Russians don't care and there's an economic war going on.
Well, Putin more or less himself has hinted that he'd be perfectly willing to make some kind of a deal. The point is that the Russians do have agents who are currently languishing in Western prisons, and they still have internalized from Soviet KGB days a culture that says, look, we will always bring our agents back. We will ask you to go and do dangerous things in foreign countries, but whether it takes us a week, a month, a year, or a decade, one way will get you back. And in particular, at the moment, attention is focusing on someone who's actually in Germany at the moment, a man by the name of Vadim Krasnikov, who was a gangster who was then engaged as a contract killer by the Russian intelligence community and was involved in the killing of a Chechen anti-Moscow militant in Berlin. So it may well be that what the Russians are hoping is that they can bring pressure to bear on the Americans, who in turn will bring pressure to bear on the Germans, and that some kind of multinational swap can be arranged.
As you say, Mark, it's almost back. It's reminiscent, isn't it, of so many of those films, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, etc., etc. It's the Cold War modus operandi, exchanges at Checkpoint Charlie.
Yeah, except the big difference is, on the whole, those exchanges were genuine spies being swapped for genuine spies.
Yeah.
This is a new Cold War, but it's not the Cold War that we remember of the the late 60s and the 70s, when in some ways everyone understood the rules of the game, they'd all been settled. This is much more 1950s, early 1960s, much more raw, much fewer rules, much fewer understandings. And that's why I think it is a particularly dangerous time.
A dangerous time in particular for journalists and even more so for American ones.
Yes, I mean, this is one of the interesting things. For example, one would never want to be complacent, but on the whole, for example, Brits have not been targeted in this way, precisely because in Britain we do not have a culture of making these kind of deals. We have had spy swaps, but not this kind of almost sort of hostage-taking negotiations. And the government is much less well placed to be able to sort of let people go. So there is an extent to which the Americans, by their sort of culture of almost plea bargaining internationally, have sort of made their own bed. But generally speaking, I mean, frankly, I think in this current environment, the Russians will go for any targets of opportunity that they find.
And this kind of method, it's not exclusive to Russia, is it? One thinks instantly of Iran, different circumstances, but taking innocent civilians and using them as hostages to bargain with. Also, China, of course, and North Korea.
Exactly, and I think this is one of the startling things that we see that Russia, until relatively recently, seemed to be sort of moving back into the kind of the sets of rules and understandings that we shared. Now it has very quickly moved way back into the sort of the pariah state realm, in which it precisely is willing to use a whole variety of methods, which also includes things like sabotage and attempted or actual assassinations in the West and so forth, which put it well beyond the pale, which is in itself, I think, a mark of a certain degree of desperation within the Russian state. But that's certainly no comfort to Evan Gershkovich at the moment.
Yeah, and thinking of poor Evan after that, I mean, 16 years in a penal colony. What help is he getting? What help are the Russians allowed him to have? Consular access, legal help, things like that.
Yeah, there is what is legally required and what is in practice allowed. The point is, what would be legally required will be regular consular access, that friends and family can send him controlled numbers of sort of parcels of food and the like, all of that kind of thing. In practice, as we've seen in other cases, the Russians have all kinds of ways of foiling that. They can move him from camp to camp for a while, which often means that he just sort of disappears from view for a matter of weeks or even months. They can, on various grounds, limit his access to his lawyers and so forth. So, in some ways, precisely because this is such a new sentence, what we'll have to do is wait and see. And in the degree to which the Russians seek deliberately to put the pressure on him will give us some clues as to whether or not they're currently in any kind of negotiations or not. If there are in negotiations, then they'll probably be much more generous to Evan. If not, they might well actually be quite vicious.